Now, moving on from history to theory, what does that say? Now, I fully agree with Ian's use of the analysis of policing as basically to do fundamentally with the application of legitimate force, which is an analysis that comes from an American sociologist called Egon Bittner, but is fundamentally derived from Max Weber's analysis of modern states. And I think the fundamental character of policing is that they are the institution charged with how to resolve conflicts that require some sort of forceful intervention. Now, obviously, good policing involves not using force, but manipulating the threat of force in order to get people to comply peacefully. But nevertheless, ultimately, it rests on force. And indeed, the growth of the police as an institution in modern society is part of what another sociologist, Norbert Elias, called the civilizing process, the process whereby widespread recourse to violence is concentrated in the hands of the state over time, and then the police are the agency specially responsible for dealing with that function on a national basis. So policing is inherently to do with conflict and problematic. But what I think is perhaps you miss out in your treatment of this argument, necessarily, I think, understandably, is that what that means is that policing is inherently a dirty, tainted occupation, an occupation that is inherently evil because it involves the threat of pain to people. Now, it's a necessary evil because as long as you have conflicts, crime, and so on, you need to have that application of pain in appropriate doses. But fundamentally, like punishment, however justified it may be in particular situations, policing involves the administration of something undesirable, which is pain and force. So policing is something that I think should be minimised, not maximised. Now, I agree fully with your critique of the paradox that we now, it's impossible for a politician to do anything in relation to policing but promise more policing. But your argument is fundamentally just about the economic difficulties involved there, and in particular the paradox of trying to increase police numbers when crime is falling. But I think beyond that, there's more to it. Policing is fundamentally an undesirable way of regulating conflict and dealing with crime. The more satisfactory way is something that I think has disappeared from public discussion, and that's the possibility that we could have social and economic and cultural policies that actually reduce the causes of crime. And Tony Blair said, tough on crime, tough on the causes of crime, but had an extremely narrow conception of what could be done about the causes of crime, because having embraced the neoliberalism that he inherited from his the Conservative predecessors, there was very limited scope for dealing with inequality and social exclusion. So relying on the police to deal with crime is at best apply a kind of unpleasant temporary palliative. The person who summed this view up to me the most effectively was Raymond Chandler in his book The Long Goodbye, when he said that to use cops to control crime is like using aspirin for a brain tumour. It can alleviate a little bit of pain on an emergency basis, but actually you need fundamental social surgery or medical surgery in the case of brain tumour. So this used to be a common analysis. When I started work on the police in the 1970s, many police chiefs used the cliche of comparing the police to the lid on a kind of boiling cauldron of social turmoil, and saying, you know, they can just do so much to keep the lid on. But with the removal of the idea that it could do anything but fundamental social causes of crime, what that's meant is that crime policy and policing policy comes down to a question of shaping better lids. The idea that you might do something about dousing the flame has gone out of current politics. So we have a species of what Paul Rogers in the context of terrorism calls lidism. How can you have good lids to hold down problems that can't be fundamentally addressed? So to go to the future, the utopian future in my view is, it is utopian, it's impossible, but there would be no police. If you could have no police, that would be wonderful. I'm not against the police. They're a necessary thing as long as you have conflicts. But we should find other ways of trying to reduce conflicts. The police should be, as it were, a last minimal resort, not just for economic reasons, but for principled reasons. Now, so the first thing I want to say is that policing should be put in its place. It's a necessary part of society, but in a way, ultimately, an undesirable part. And we have to find other ways of trying to reduce the problems and conflicts and tensions that the police deal with. Security ultimately derives not from policing in even its broadest form, but from wider social and cultural processes. The second is putting it the other way around. Crime shouldn't be seen as the be-all and end-all of policing. Police always have dealt with many other problems that don't have a crime face. They are one of the emergency social services, and fire brigade policing has become essentially a pejorative term. Until recently, I myself never used it except on a pejorative basis, because there is a problem, of course, if the police just rush around to emergency after emergency and see speedy responses as the end. But in another sense, I think the idea of fire brigade policing is a desirable one, which is that the police should be recognised as an emergency service and not just a crime-fighting thing. Yeah, and then just two very brief other points. The problem-solving, problem-oriented policing are mantra at the moment of what are progressive directions to go in. I think problem orientation, fine. Problem solving is misleading. The police can never ultimately solve the problems they're addressing. And fourthly, the governance issue. I just wanted to briefly say that I think that it seems to me that the police should not be governed in a way that is different from other public services. The tripartite model, which is the one that we still basically have as the fundamental bedrock of it, is the right one. I think the local element of it needs beefing up. But within a division between professional police, central government and local government, and the idea of having directly elected chiefs or authorities, I agree fully with your reservations.